They say the dead cannot speak, but in Sydney Cove, where the scorching sun bleaches bones and the salt wind carries whispers from unmarked graves, the settlers learned otherwise. It was old Mary Sullivan who first taught me this truth on the night before she died. I was a young constable then, barely 20, eager to dismiss her ravings as the confusion of age. But she gripped my wrist with surprising strength, her rheumy eyes suddenly clear and sharp as broken glass. "Listen well, boy," she rasped, her breath sour with sickness. "I've carried this for 13 years, and I'll not take it to hell with me. There's a woman buried in unhallowed ground, past the settlement's edge, beneath the eucalyptus that blooms white when all others bloom gold. They say she took her own life. They say she was weak, mad, broken by this harsh land. She pulled me closer, her fingers digging into my flesh like talons. They lie. And I know, because I heard her die. What Mary told me that night would haunt me for the rest of my days. It was a story of murder dressed as mercy, of justice denied, and a soul that refused to rest. It was a story of how evil can wear a carpenter's apron and a friendly smile, of how truth can be buried as easily as a body, and of how sometimes the buried refuse to stay silent. The tale began on a sweltering January morning in 1790, when Thomas Crawford came running through the settlement, his face a mask of grief, crying that his beloved Margaret had hanged herself from the old tree behind their cottage. It should have ended there, with the magistrate's swift ruling and a hurried burial. But this story didn't end. It couldn't end, because Margaret Crawford had unfinished business, and the dead, I've learned, can be far more patient and far more terrible than the living. What follows is the truth of what happened in those years, pieced together from Mary's deathbed confession, from testimonies that came too late, and from my own investigations into events that defy natural explanation. Some will call it superstition, some will call it madness. But I was there for the end of it, and I saw things that no rational mind can explain away. This is the story of how a murdered woman took 13 years to speak her truth. This is the story of how justice, though delayed, found its way home through shadows and whispers, and the relentless memory of the dead. This is the story of Margaret Crawford, who would not, could not, be silenced. And it begins, as all tragedies do, with love turned to poison. The colonial settlement of Sydney Cove was barely 2 years old when Margaret Crawford's body was found swaying from the old eucalyptus tree behind a cottage. Her husband, Thomas Crawford, a respected carpenter from the First Fleet, discovered her at dawn, or so he claimed. "She's been melancholy since we arrived," Thomas told the constable, his voice breaking convincingly. "This wretched land, it broke her spirit." The settlement was harsh, brutal. Suicide wasn't uncommon. The magistrate ruled it self-murder within the hour, eager to return to more pressing matters of survival. Margaret was buried in unhallowed ground, denied Christian rites, her name whispered with pity and shame. But old Mary Sullivan, the Irish washerwoman, knew better. She'd heard the Crawfords arguing the night before, heard Thomas's rage, heard something heavy fall, heard silence. When she mentioned it to the constable, he waved her away. "The ravings of a convict woman," he said, "worth less than nothing." Thomas inherited Margaret's small savings and married again within 6 months. A young woman named Elizabeth, fresh off a transport ship. The settlement gossiped, but quickly forgot. Death was too common to dwell upon. Yet strange things began happening at the Crawford cottage. Elizabeth woke to the sound of weeping in the dead of night. Thomas found his tools scattered each morning, though he'd carefully stored them. The old eucalyptus tree where Margaret died began to wither, its leaves turning black, though the rest of the bush bloomed green. One night, Elizabeth woke to find a woman standing at the foot of their bed, pale, with a terrible bruise around her throat. The apparition pointed at Thomas, her mouth moving soundlessly, before vanishing. It was just a dream, Thomas assured her, though his hands trembled. The isolation plays tricks on the mind. But it wasn't a dream, and Margaret Crawford's spirit had only just begun to speak. 5 years passed. Thomas Crawford prospered as Sydney Cove grew into a town. He built a larger house, took on apprentices, and became a man of some standing. Elizabeth bore him 2 children, though she grew thin and nervous, jumping at shadows. "She sees things," the other women whispered. "Mad, like the first wife." But Elizabeth wasn't mad. Margaret's ghost had grown stronger, more solid. She appeared not just at night, now, but in reflections, in water buckets, in window glass, in the blade of a knife. Always with that bruised throat, always pointing, always accusing. Thomas began drinking heavily. His work suffered. He raged at Elizabeth, calling her a lunatic, threatening to have her committed to the asylum they were building for the colony's insane. Old Mary Sullivan, now freed from her convict bonds, watched with grim satisfaction. She'd kept Margaret's secret all these years, but she hadn't forgotten. She began asking questions around the settlement, carefully, quietly. She learned that Thomas had debts before Margaret died. She learned that Margaret had inherited a small fortune from an aunt in England, money that arrived on a ship just weeks before her death. Mary also discovered something else. The carpenter's apprentice, now a grown man with his own shop, who remembered Thomas ordering him away early that fatal day. Said he needed private time with his wife, the man recalled. Said they had matters to discuss. Thought nothing of it then, but his face. It was cold, calculating. Mary began collecting testimonies. But who would listen to an old convict woman accusing a respected tradesman? That's when the children began to see her too. Thomas's own son, barely 5 years old, started speaking to the sad lady in the shadows. He drew pictures of a woman with a rope around her neck. His daughter woke screaming, saying, "The lady with the purple throat told her, 'Papa is a liar.'" Elizabeth finally confronted her husband. "What did you do to her, Thomas? What did you do to Margaret?" His hand rose to strike her and froze. In the mirror behind Elizabeth, Margaret stood, her ghostly hand gripping his wrist with impossible strength. Her mouth opened, and this time sound emerged, a hollow, accusing whisper that filled the house. "Murderer." Thomas fled into the night, Elizabeth's screams following him into the darkness. Thomas Crawford didn't return home that night, or the next. On the 3rd day, a search party found him at the old eucalyptus tree, the same tree where Margaret had supposedly hanged herself. He was alive but raving, clawing at his own throat, screaming that she wouldn't let him breathe. "She's choking me. Can't you see her? She's here. She's always here." They dragged him back to Sydney, where he was confined to his bed. Elizabeth, freed from his tyranny, began to speak. Mary Sullivan added her voice. The apprentice came forward. Piece by piece, the truth emerged. The magistrate, the same one who'd ruled Margaret's death a suicide, was forced to reopen the investigation. Under the pressure of public scrutiny and with Thomas incapacitated by madness, witnesses who'd been silent now spoke freely. The evidence painted a damning picture. Thomas had strangled Margaret in a rage over her refusal to give him her inheritance money. He'd staged the hanging afterward, counting on the settlement's desperation and prejudice to accept the simplest explanation. He'd been right, until Margaret herself refused to stay silent. As the magistrate prepared to formally charge Thomas Crawford with murder, the man lay in his bed, eyes bulging, hands clawing at an invisible noose around his throat. Doctors could find no physical cause for his suffering. "She's here," he gasped, "every moment, choking me as I choked her." On the 7th night of his confinement, Thomas Crawford died. His face was purple, his eyes bloodshot, his tongue protruding, exactly as if he'd been strangled. Yet the door had been locked from the outside, and no one had entered his room. The magistrate ruled it death by divine justice. Thomas Crawford was buried in the same unhallowed ground where Margaret had been laid to rest years before. But there was one final act. Old Mary Sullivan, with Elizabeth's blessing, arranged for Margaret's body to be exhumed and reburied in consecrated ground with full Christian rites. A simple marker was placed. Margaret Crawford, 1755-1780, murdered. Justice delayed but not denied. The night after Margaret's reburial, Elizabeth reported something that the whole settlement came to witness. The old eucalyptus tree, dead and blackened for 5 years, suddenly bloomed. White flowers appeared overnight, their sweet scent carrying on the wind. At dawn, a woman in white was seen standing beneath the tree, tall, peaceful, her throat unmarked. She looked toward the settlement, smiled, and faded like morning mist. Margaret Crawford was finally at rest. But in Sydney town, they say that Thomas Crawford is not. On certain nights, near the old burial ground, people report hearing a man's voice crying out in terror, begging for mercy, choking on words that will never be answered. Some sins, the settlers learned, leave stains that not even death can wash away. I write this account now, 30 years after Margaret Crawford's reburial, as an old man whose hair has gone white and whose hands tremble with palsy. But my memory of those events remains sharp, cut into my mind like inscriptions on a tombstone. The settlement has grown into a proper town now. Sydney is no longer the desperate, brutal outpost it once was. New buildings cover the old graves. Progress, they call it. Forgetting, I call it. But some things refuse to be forgotten. The eucalyptus tree still stands, ancient now, its white flowers blooming every January, the month Margaret died. The settlers built around it, refusing to cut it down despite its prime location. Some say it's respect for the dead. I know it's fear. 3 men tried to fell that tree over the years. All 3 died within a fortnight. Accidents, the authorities claimed. Convenient accidents. Elizabeth Crawford remarried, a kind man who treated her well. She lived to old age and never spoke publicly of what she witnessed in that house, though she confided in me once, near the end of her life. "I still see her sometimes," she whispered. "Not frightening anymore, just watching, making sure we remember." Thomas and Margaret's children grew up haunted by their father's sins. The boy became a priest, dedicating his life to the service of God, perhaps seeking redemption for crimes he didn't commit. The girl never married, spending her days tending to her mother's grave, and I'm told, the grave of the woman who came before. As for Thomas Crawford's final resting place, well, the unhallowed ground where he was buried has never grown a single blade of grass. The earth there remains barren, black, as though scorched by invisible fire. Visitors to the cemetery give that corner a wide berth, especially after dark, because the choking sounds still echo there. I've heard them myself on nights when duty required me to patrol near the old burial grounds. A man's voice, desperate and pleading, cut off by the sound of strangling. It lasts exactly 7 minutes. I timed it once, though I'll never do so again. 7 minutes of terror, played over and over, night after night, for eternity. Some of the younger constables laugh it off as wind through the trees or the calls of night birds. Let them laugh. They weren't there. They didn't see Thomas Crawford's face as he died, purple and bulging, his hands clawing at invisible fingers around his throat. They didn't see the satisfaction in Mary Sullivan's eyes as she watched justice finally being served. I've kept the records, you see, all of them, the original ruling of suicide, the witness statements that came too late, the testimony of the apprentice, Mary's deathbed confession, Elizabeth's account of the hauntings, even the magistrate's reluctant admission that justice had been denied. I've kept them because the world needs to remember that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like a respected tradesman with a firm handshake. Sometimes it wears the mask of grief while hiding a murderer's heart. And sometimes, just sometimes, the universe finds a way to balance the scales. Even if it takes 13 years and the intervention of forces we cannot explain. They ask me sometimes, the young ones, if I truly believe in ghosts. If I really think Margaret Crawford's spirit strangled her husband from beyond the grave. I tell them this: I believe in truth, I believe in justice, and I believe that some deaths cannot be escaped, not even in death. Margaret Crawford was murdered. Her killer went free for 13 years, built a life on her grave, slept soundly in the bed where he'd plotted her death. But in the end, the truth emerged. In the end, justice was served. Call it divine intervention. Call it supernatural vengeance. Call it coincidence if you must. But when you pass that eucalyptus tree with its white blooms, when you hear the choking sounds from the barren earth at the cemetery's edge, when you feel a cold presence in the night air of Sydney town, remember Margaret Crawford. Remember that some voices cannot be silenced, no matter how deep you bury them. I am old now, and my time grows short. Soon I'll join the countless dead who rest beneath this city's streets. But before I go, I needed to set this down in writing. The official records tell only part of the story. This document tells the rest. Let it stand as testimony. Let it stand as warning. The dead can speak if you're willing to listen. And some truths, once buried, will claw their way back to the light, no matter how long it takes, no matter who stands in their way. Margaret Crawford saw to that. From the Private Journal of Constable William Barrett, Sydney Town, 1823. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. I have seen them. I have witnessed them. And I will carry the weight of that knowledge to my grave. A grave, I pray, will be far from the unhallowed ground where Thomas Crawford lies choking for all eternity.